certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Kira Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Defence today told court Bradley Edwards never intended to kill his rape victim. He planned his attack carefully, but murder was not part of that plan. If he wanted to kill her, she would be dead, Mr Jovich said. Hi everyone, Natalie Bonjolo, Tim Clarke and Damien Cripps with you today, day 92 of Claremont in Conversation. Tim, Mr Jovich resumed his third day of closing arguments today, and today he was really focusing on the Karrakatta crime.
Yeah. So he did get to that. He touched on that on Friday, but really went into it in depth today. And that young lady was in court to hear all of that argument right up till lunchtime. And there were two strands to it, really. There was Mr Jovich stressing that obviously Mr Edwards had pleaded guilty to that crime, that it was a very serious crime, obviously, and sympathised in a lot of ways with the victim, saying that it was no doubt it would have been a dreadful ordeal, and that her accounts of it, various as they were, over many, many years, were essentially to be believed, and he wasn't casting any doubt on anything that she'd said, in essence. But what he did say, and the main tenet of the argument, was that when you compared that crime to the murders of Jane and Kira and Sarah, that there were so many differences and various fundamental differences that his argument was that it shouldn't and couldn't be used that much as propensity evidence to point to the offender in the rape, which we know is Mr Edwards, being inevitably the person, or even inferentially the person that committed the crimes that began just under a year later when Sarah went missing, and then continued over another almost 12 months to when Kira went missing and was discovered. So that was the basic premise of what he was saying, but then he went through point by point to highlight some of those fundamental differences he said were there, and that Justice Hall should really, really look closely at.
Yeah, so I mean, really he is challenging any link between that crime and the murders, and he started by raising doubts about the fibres on the shorts of the victim.
Yes, that's right. So Mr Jovich sort of warned us, I suppose, a little bit that he's going to go through the fibre evidence in much more detail later on in the week. But the first thing he wanted to look at was these fibres on the shorts of the Karrakatta victim. Now, the prosecution say that must be a link, and an intrinsic link, and a vital link between all three women, because those fibres came from the same source, i.e. Telstra workwear. They were on all three women, i.e. there is a physical, tangible connection between all those crimes. But what Mr Jovich then began his arguments with were a suggestion that, given the night that the young lady who eventually was raped in Karrakatta had leading up to that crime, i.e. there were 4 different venues that she'd visited and 2 different vehicles that she'd travelled in, and all the interactions that she'd had at those 2 or 6 places, that he said that there could be an argument that those fibres got there coincidentally, i.e. through another transfer event at one of those venues or in one of those cars. Now, Justice Hall was quite quick to jump on this point, or ask Mr Jovich to expand on this point, and he said he would do in due course. But that was the general argument. And so if those fibres had gone on those shorts coincidentally, then that would rule out any particular causal link, in particular the prosecution argument that they inevitably got there via transfer from either Mr. Edwards directly or from his vehicle, which it will be very interesting to see how Mr. Jovic does expand and
Yes.
work on that argument, because from my reading of the questions from Justice Hall, he was immediately, questioning that line of logic.
Yeah, that's right. And what about the vehicle itself? Because Mr. Jovic was also questioning which vehicle was used during the Karrakatta attack.
Yeah, so we heard evidence in the trial and then submissions on it last week about the particular type of vehicle that was used in that crime. The young lady described ostensibly and over the various statements she made, a white panel van. And then we heard evidence from a security guard at Hollywood Hospital later saying that he thought he had seen a panel van with Telstra markings leaving or driving around that area at about 4:30, 4:45 that morning. Now, Mr. Jovic sort of questioned whether that evidence can be taken totally at face value for several reasons. Well, one of the main ones being the victim in the Karrakatta crime was hooded, and so wasn't able to particularly describe her surroundings after that. And she also said on various occasions that she kept her eyes closed a lot during the whole ordeal because she was so frightened. And so Mr. Jovic pointed that out and said, well, so what can we really take from her remembrance of this attack because of what she said in terms of what she could actually see? But Justice Hall then raised the point, well, is it absolutely vital to know absolutely what type of vehicle it was? Because what she does describe is a vehicle with space in it that was light coloured, and she consistently said this. Whereas comparing Mr. Edwards' own personal car at that time, which was something called a Ford LTT station wagon, that was nothing like anything she described. And so Justice Hall pointed out, well, so what other car could it be, or what other vehicle could it be other than a pool vehicle or a Telstra vehicle that Mr. Edwards had access to? Jovic said, well, we can't really argue against that, Your Honour, because we certainly can't say it was his own car. And then Justice Hall took that one stage further and said, well, wouldn't that then beg the argument, well, if she's inevitably in a Telstra, some sort of Telstra vehicle, then isn't it inevitable that is where, or it's certainly highly likely where those fibres have come from, i.e. being transferred from a vehicle? And take that one step further, isn't that what the prosecutors say then happened to Jane and Kira? So that is something from my reading of it, Mr. Jovic is going to have to work quite hard at when he gets to that fibre evidence, because there were several concessions he had to make, particularly the make and where the vehicle had come from. And then it seemed to me quite a logical step for Justice Hall to take in his reasoning. And Mr. Jovic says, yes, I will turn to that reasoning and address it in due course.
Yeah, Damien, I might be wrong here, but I wonder if this may be a source of frustration or maybe confusion for people, because Mr. Edwards has pleaded guilty to the rape, yet the details of the car used haven't been proven in evidence. And I just wonder if some people are thinking, well, why can't we ask him that question because he's right there?
Well, he's chosen not to give evidence.
Yeah.
That's about as simple as it gets, Nat, I think. He's chosen not to give evidence, and this is a trial in relation to the three allegations he's currently facing. So, but I certainly understand what you mean.
Yeah, I know we can't just ask him. I'm just thinking that people are probably thinking to themselves, okay, well, we're having a discussion about this evidence that doesn't conclude what the car is that's used. And the accused has admitted this part of this crime. So therefore, wouldn't it be good if during maybe the police interview, these details had been brought to light?
Well, yeah, absolutely. But as everybody in every line of work would understand, I hindsight would be a fantastic thing to have at the time of doing something, and it just might be the case that, you know, the officers that would have arrested him at the time would have had so many things they were trying to deal with that, from my point of view, it's understandable that they can't foresee every problem that's going to arise in a trial that goes, what are we at, 96 days?
92, nearly.
Not 92 days. I mean, it's foreseeable. And as the case is with every trial, some things, you know, if you look at the fact that we can't ask the accused person about this as something that falls in his favour, well, the way to look at that is that in every trial, there are some things that fall in favour of one party and there are some things that fall in favour of the other party. And that's not by design. That's just sometimes the way things go. So, unfortunately, in this case, we're in a position where the accused man is not in a position or is not, you know, available to have that question asked of him.
Yeah. Tim, Mr. Jovich went on to really try and show why the rape and the murders are fundamentally different.
Yes, he did that, and that was really at the heart of the major part of his arguments today. And the major part of that argument was a pretty obvious one, in that victim in the Karrakatta crime, as horrific as her ordeal was, she was not killed. She was not murdered at the end of that ordeal. Was left in a bush, in another bush, but was alive, and that was where Miss Barbara Gallo went, or was going with her contention last week, that those actions, i.e. in coming back and then and depositing this young woman in these bushes when Mr. Edwards thought she might have been unconscious, or she was certainly acting like she was unconscious, was a preparation for then later coming back and killing her. But that was thwarted by the fact that the young lady managed to escape. And the other evidence that went to that was this sighting of this van, this car, by the security guard, which was suggested by Miss Barbara Gallo that could have been Mr. Edwards returning to what was described today as finishing the job off. Now, obviously, Mr. Jovich pointed to that and said, well, that is a fundamental difference, and there is no overt suggestion in anything that's done in other than, some of the listeners might find this a bit outrageous, but it was Mr. Jovich's argument, not mine, that apart from the actions in what he'd done, there was no other overt violence, if you like. There was no weapon involved, as far as we can tell from what the young lady had told police. There was no other sort of striking or punching or anything of that kind. So what did happen, there was no other overt violent act. And then there was other factors to the way that the attack was structured, if you want to put it that way, and perpetrated, that didn't align with what had allegedly or has been suggested happened to Sarah and Kira and Jane. So one of those was the screams. We know that the Karrakatta victim was gagged for quite a long portion of her attack, whereas the evidence suggested by the prosecution is that Jane and Sarah both screamed in the moments before they were either killed or certainly incapacitated. There was the fact that this was a so-called blitz attack. So the young lady was attacked from behind, incapacitated, quickly hooded, and then put into a car and then driven around. Whereas in the cases of Jane, we think, and Kira, on the basis of eyewitness accounts, very strongly suggested by the prosecution, they were lured into this car or somehow persuaded to get into this car rather than, sort of attacked and then bundled into this car. There was the fact that there was no overt direct evidence on either Jane or Kira that they were sexually assaulted, even though that Jane was found naked, and that evidence simply isn't there. So, and Mr. Jovich said that these are not just odd little quirks. These are fundamental differences between these attacks, which he says should mean that the propensity evidence, as it's framed by the prosecution, shouldn't be taken even at face value. It shouldn't be taken at all by Justice Hall.
Did Justice Hall interrupt much with questions during this portion?
Yes, a little bit, but this was a section that Mr. Jovich was allowed in the most part to develop as a whole, if you like. I mean, there were sort of a couple of questions here and there, just to a bit like last week with Miss Barbara Gallo, that he wanted to get very clear in his mind the absolute tenet of what Mr. Jovich was saying. But
Damien, obviously there's no disputing that Mr. Edwards is a sexually motivated attacker, but his intention to kill or not intention to kill the teenage victim, it's quite important in this point, isn't it?
I think, Nat, what passes through my mind is I feel for any judge or magistrate or anyone in that position of considering whether propensity evidence can be admitted, and if the propensity evidence is admitted, what work it is that you propose that propensity evidence will do. I find it a really challenging subject. It's essentially saying, let's some extremely circumstantial evidence from a prior or a subsequent incident in to assist the person who's making a decision make that decision, but let's not let it in if it's too prejudicial. Yeah. I mean, it's a terribly difficult proposition, I think, for anyone. And I mean, I'm sure judges and people who have been doing it for a long time would argue with me and say it's not terribly difficult. But I'm only speaking from a personal point of view. If whenever I consider it, I always think that it would be terribly difficult to work out whether you were going to let it in or not let it in. And in this case, from what Tim's saying, it sounds like the defence are asking, understandably, that it not be allowed to be in. But as in relation to what you've just asked, Nat, it is extremely important because I guess it's suggesting that you are looking at an accused person who's not convicted yet of these three offences that has a propensity to be, as you put it, sexually motivated. But is that the question? I think was really well put by the defence, if I understood what Tim had said, that realistically in relation to the three offences that are currently being considered, there's no evidence of any sexual offending. So realistically on that basis, the propensity evidence, just from where I'm standing, seems to be something that can't go in. But there would be an argument about the issues even before that, the argument about, he's motivated to pursue young women. He's motivated to be out late at night. There's a number of different things that the convictions might assist the trier of fact in dealing with. But not only dealing with, they've got to deal with it in a way that's worded quite strangely as well. It's in that it helps them not exclude that as an activity that the person might do. I'm not sure that I've worded that very well, but that's essentially what we're asking propensity evidence to do, is to say to someone that, if you were previously convicted of doing something, then the jury or the trier of fact could be satisfied that that's not something that you would not do. In my view, it's a difficult proposition, and I always feel for the people who are having to deal with making decisions about it going in.
Just carrying on from that, I guess the arguments here are poles apart, and I think now we can sort of look and see why maybe Mr. Jovich needs such a long time for these closing submissions.
I think, I was feeling for the prosecution last week Nat, and we're feeling for the defence this week. It's a really hard job. I mean, to consider that we start with nothing. I mean, we start with, obviously, you start with a blank slate when the trial starts, and then both parties build up this position that they're going to get to the end and try to argue to succeed. It doesn't seem like there's a whole lot. It doesn't seem like, on the face of it, that's hard. But when you're playing out like we are at the moment through the quantum of material that they've got to close on, it's a terribly difficult thing to go through logically, and that's why the best lawyers in the world are the ones that always end up running these cases.
Yeah, and Tim, a very difficult day, of course, for the victim today as well, I expect.
Very, very. I saw her exiting the court at lunchtime. She looked, as you'd imagine, she would look, because not only are you having to relive probably the worst moment of your life again, you're actually having your account of it not so much doubted, but certainly scrutinised and questioned. And she said, actually, in one of the statements, that she did think she was going to die. And now Mr. Jovich is categorically saying on behalf of my client that was not his intention. So, it would have been a hugely hard day to have all that again brought up. But as we've said so many times, it is necessary. It's hard. But it is necessary for Mr. Jovich to put these arguments and thoughts in front of Justice Hall, so he can consider them when the time comes.
That's right. And Mr. Jovich also honed in on the Telstra living witnesses today, and in a way he was kind of saying that their testimonies in a way diminish the state's case.
Yeah, so that was his argument. So, as our listeners will remember, the Telstra Living Witness Project was something that the police embarked on with a view to finding potentially other victims or other women that had come into contact with anyone that might be similar to a prowling predator in Claremont in the mid-90s. And they found several of these accounts, and at least 4 of these accounts took in a detail that included a Telstra vehicle. And those are the ones that Ms. Barbagallo relied on and really honed in on last week, to say, we say that this proves that that not only a person, but we say that that person was Mr. Edwards, was out and about in Claremont in exactly this time frame, doing this to other women, or trying to lure other women into his car. Mr. Jovich really went hard on that interpretation today, and said not only does this not come close to identifying this person as Mr. Edwards, but we say potentially identifies another person in a Telstra car that could have been doing these predatory things in exactly the same time frame as these crimes were being committed. And the way he did this was to, again, point out inconsistencies between the accounts, and in particular pointed out an identikit sketch that was put together by the first of these Telstra living witnesses, a lady called Julianne Johnston, and her account was so important and potentially so central is because she could precisely date this encounter that she had as January the 28th, 1996, which would put it exactly almost 24 hours after Sarah Spears went missing. Now, it's very hard to describe a photo fit via a podcast, so I hope that some listeners might be interested enough to go online and have a look, because that identikit is up there. When we first saw it in court, some of us were, way back in December last year, some of us were convinced it didn't look like Mr. Edwards, and some said, well, yeah, it could be him. And it could be him, but it also could be anyone.
Yes.
And Mr. Jovich's point today was, look, as the closest it can come is that it is a Caucasian male under 40, which is what Mr. Edwards was. But he said in other details, the long sort of hair at the back, the receding hairline at the front, it just didn't line up. And so Mr. Jovich said, not only does that, positively go against it being Mr. Edwards, but then it could actually suggest that there was someone else out there, trying to accost and lure women in a car that might well have belonged to Telstra.
That's right. And Damien, it's interesting because Mr. Edwards hasn't been identified by these witnesses. There is no CCTV footage placing him in the area. And I wonder if the prosecution would have had to ponder whether to include these living witnesses or not.
I think that it would have been something that they thought about for a long, long time. I think for everyone that's been following along with this trial, all of us that are involved in it, all of us that have followed along, we might be a bit caught up in the size of this trial and the impact of this trial that's having on the state and everyone in the state. But the point that you just made then, that's extremely important, that there's no identification, there's no CCTV footage. Look, certainly appreciate there's a lot of other evidence. It puts us in the position we're in where we're having a trial and there's good reason behind that. But you don't get past the fact that on one of the cases, there's not even a body. I'd say that obviously with the greatest of respect. I feel for the prosecution trying to work out how they were going to put their case together. Because at the very least, the defence got to see the prosecution case before they commenced their case, if you could put it that way.
Yes.
But as we come back to every single time, I feel like every time I'm on the podcast, what about the man at the head of the ship, the justice that has got to make the decision? So not just the prosecution who have got to ponder whether they're going to run it, but now Justice Hall is about to, at some point in the not too distant future, commence pondering what impact it has on his decision that they did include it.
Yeah, that's right. And Tim, even today, Mr. Jovich had a go about the Telstra logos potentially covering up the car.
Yeah, so this was an argument that was made by Ms. Barbara Gallo. She said, on one hand, if the Telstra logos were visible on the cars, then that could have made the driver of the car seem a bit more trustworthy, and so that might have been a reason that any young lady, not just Jane or Kira or Sarah, might have got into the car. But then on the other hand, she also said at one point that those logos might have been covered up with some sort of other decal. And Mr. Jovich obviously jumped on that and said, well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Yeah. Either he was using the Telstra logo, not necessarily Mr. Edwards or this person that was driving around Claremont, was using it to, ensnare young women by sort of ensuring that they were all right, or he wasn't. So yeah, again, just another little knock on a block of the Jenga tower, if you want. Just trying to make things wobble a little bit more than otherwise we might have thought when Miss Barbara Gallo was doing her stuff last week.
Yeah, that's right. And Defence obviously has plenty more to come because Mr. Jovich indicated he still has a way to go before he'll finish his closing submissions.
Yeah, indeed, Nat. At least Wednesday, we think now. That's what he said today. He's got plenty more to go through. Obviously, the fibres, that will take a long time. And then he's going to sort of pick through the actual murders themselves and the direct evidence from there, and presumably point out some inconsistencies there. He's got a fair way to travel yet, as have we.
Damien, do you think Ms. Barbagallo would have anticipated just how detailed Mr. Jovich's closing submissions would be in terms of picking, holes in the prosecution case?
100%. I would have thought that she would have almost banked on it. I don't know for certain, but I'm fairly sure that both the prosecutor and the defence lawyers all know each other to some extent, and they would know each other professionally. So I would have thought that she would have anticipated it to some extent.
Yeah, right.
You could tell, and you can tell that, Nat, by the amount of detail that she went into, and
Yes.
and how we discussed last week that she was already sort of anticipating some of the things that Mr. Jovich was going to say, and getting her, getting her punches in first, as it were. So, but.
He's definitely going to take more time with closing than she has, though.
This is his. Yeah, I think he is, and this is his. This is his big moment, I suppose. And I mean, he is fighting very hard on the behalf of his client, who is facing, the most serious charges you could possibly imagine.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both very much for your time today, and thank you for being with us for week 24. It's been quite a journey, but we are close to the finish. Join us tomorrow. That's Nat, Tim and Alison for day 93 of Claremont in Conversation.
This podcast is hosted by Natalie Bongiolo, produced by Kate Ryan, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au. And if local news delivered differently appeals to you, tune into WA's newest morning show, The West Live with Jenna Clarke. It's talkback radio, but without the interruptions. Listen live weekdays from 8:45 a.m. on thewest.com.au or catch up with the podcast.